The autumn leaves had begun their inevitable descent, carpeting the front lawn of the old Victorian house in shades of amber and rust. Susan Hartwell stood at her bay window, watching as yet another Sunday afternoon slipped away without a single visitor. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its melancholic tone echoing through rooms that had once overflowed with laughter, sticky fingerprints, and the chaotic joy of grandchildren underfoot. Now, at 72, Susan found herself in a peculiar position that many elderly people face, but few openly discuss. She was surrounded by family in theory, yet profoundly alone in practice. Her 3 children had given her 7 grandchildren, ranging from ages 16 to 31. And while birthday cards arrived with clockwork precision and obligatory holiday visits were marked on calendars, something fundamental had shifted in recent years. The quality of their presence had changed, becoming transactional rather than relational, dutiful rather than delightful. Susan wasn't the type to wallow in self-pity. Her late husband, Richard, had always admired her analytical mind, the way she approached problems with the precision of a chess player thinking several moves ahead. It was this quality that had made her such a formidable businesswoman before retirement, and it was this same quality that now turned her attention toward a question that had been gnawing at her for months. Did her grandchildren actually love her, or had she become merely an obligation on their to-do lists, a box to check between yoga classes and business meetings? The thought had first crystallized during last Christmas, when her eldest grandson, Marcus, had spent the entire dinner glued to his phone, occasionally looking up to offer mechanical compliments about the turkey. Her granddaughter Jennifer had arrived late, left early, and spent most of her visit talking about her upcoming vacation to Bali. Even the younger ones, whom she'd thought might retain some genuine affection, seemed distracted and distant, their eyes glazing over when she shared stories from her past. Susan understood that life moved quickly for young people. She remembered her own youth, the way responsibilities and ambitions could consume your attention. But something about the modern era felt different. The disconnection seemed deeper, more profound. Technology had promised to bring people closer together, yet it seemed to have achieved the opposite effect, creating a generation that was constantly connected yet emotionally unavailable. It was a Tuesday morning in October when the idea first took shape. Susan had been reading a mystery novel, one of those clever psychological thrillers where the protagonist sets up an elaborate scheme to uncover the truth. As she turned the pages, sipping her Earl Grey tea, a thought struck her with such force that she actually set her cup down with a sharp clink against the saucer. What if she could design her own test? Not something cruel or vindictive, but a carefully constructed situation that would reveal the true nature of her grandchildren's affection. She spent the next week thinking it through, refining the concept, considering the ethics and potential consequences. Richard would have called it one of her projects, though this one was far more personal than her previous endeavors. The beauty of the plan was its subtlety. She wouldn't announce that she was testing anyone. Instead, she would create what appeared to be a legitimate family initiative, something that would require time, effort, and genuine care. The responses would tell her everything she needed to know. Susan decided to call it the Hartwell Family Legacy Project. The premise was simple, yet compelling. She would tell her grandchildren that she was working on documenting the family history, creating a comprehensive archive of stories, photographs, and memorabilia that would be passed down through generations. She would need help, she'd explain, sorting through decades of accumulated materials, digitizing old photos, conducting recorded interviews about family memories. It would require regular visits, sustained effort, and genuine engagement. But here was the crucial element that would make this a true test of loyalty. She would hint, subtly but unmistakably, that those who participated most actively in the project would be remembered most generously in her will. She wouldn't make explicit promises, nothing that could be considered manipulative or coercive, but she would let the implication hang in the air. This way, she could observe who came out of genuine affection versus who showed up motivated by potential inheritance. The plan had layers, like those Russian nesting dolls she'd collected during a trip to Moscow decades ago. The first layer was simple participation. Who would show up at all? Who would make excuses or simply ghost the entire endeavor? The second layer involved sustained effort. Who would return week after week, even when the tasks became tedious or time-consuming? The third layer was the most revealing. Who would demonstrate genuine interest in her stories, her life, her experiences, beyond just completing assigned tasks? Susan spent considerable time preparing. She pulled out boxes from the attic, organized photographs into rough chronological groups, and created a list of potential projects that would require varying levels of commitment. Some tasks could be completed in an afternoon. Others would require weeks of dedication. She also prepared her documentation system. In a leather-bound journal that she kept locked in her desk drawer, she would record everything: attendance, attitude, effort, authenticity. She would note who asked personal questions, who seemed engaged versus distracted, who offered to help beyond the assigned tasks. She even set up a small camera system, ostensibly to record family interviews, but positioned in ways that would capture natural interactions when her grandchildren thought they weren't being observed. It wasn't about spying, Susan told herself. It was about seeing the truth that people hide behind polite smiles and socially appropriate behavior. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Susan sent out personalized invitations. Not a group text or mass email, but individual letters, handwritten on her good stationery, mailed in elegant cream envelopes. Each letter was slightly different, tailored to the specific grandchild, but all contained the same essential message. She was embarking on this legacy project and would be honored if they would participate. She mentioned that she'd been thinking about how to distribute her estate and wanted to ensure that those who truly valued family history would be the ones to preserve and inherit it. The responses began trickling in within days, and they were remarkably revealing even at this preliminary stage. Marcus, the eldest at 31, sent a brief text message acknowledging receipt of the letter and promising to try to make time, though he was incredibly busy with the new startup. No mention of when he might visit or what level of commitment he could offer. Jennifer, 29, responded with an enthusiastic email full of exclamation points, declaring how absolutely amazing this project sounded and how she'd definitely be there. Susan noted the enthusiasm, but remained skeptical. Jennifer's track record on follow-through was spotty at best. Her grandson Tyler, 27, called her directly. That alone set him apart. In an era of text messages and emails, the fact that he picked up the phone and spoke to her for 20 minutes was significant. He asked thoughtful questions about the project, what would be involved, what her goals were. He didn't mention the inheritance angle at all, which Susan found either very tactful or genuinely disinterested in that aspect. Her granddaughter Emma, 25, responded with what could only be described as a legal brief. Her email outlined her availability, constraints, and what she could and couldn't commit to, all laid out with bullet points and subheadings. Emma was studying corporate law, and it showed. Everything was transactional, negotiated, conditional. The younger 4 grandchildren ranged from 16 to 22, and their responses were predictably varied. Rachel, 22, seemed genuinely excited and immediately asked when they could start. Brandon, 20, sent a meme in response, which Susan had to ask her neighbor's teenager to explain to her. It was apparently meant to be humorous, but conveyed no actual commitment. Sophia, 18, was characteristically dramatic, declaring that she would totally be there every single weekend because she loved vintage stuff, and this sounds so aesthetic. Susan wasn't entirely sure what aesthetic meant in this context, but she appreciated the enthusiasm, even if it seemed somewhat superficial. The youngest, Michael, 16, simply replied okay to the text his mother forwarded him. Susan didn't expect much from Michael, who was at that age where everything beyond video games and friends seemed like an imposition. Still, she'd include him in the invitation and see what happened. The first official gathering was scheduled for the following Saturday. Susan prepared her home meticulously, setting up the dining room as a sort of command center with tables for sorting photographs a laptop for digital scanning, and comfortable chairs arranged around the space. She baked her famous apple cinnamon coffee cake and prepared a full pot of coffee, along with hot chocolate for the younger ones. She wanted to make it inviting, warm, the kind of environment that would encourage people to stay and engage. Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and unusually warm temperatures for November. Susan was up early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She'd committed to this test, but now that the moment was approaching, she wondered if she really wanted to know the truth. What if all of them disappointed her? What if none of them showed up? By 10 o'clock, the designated start time, Susan was stationed in her kitchen, periodically peeking through the curtains toward the driveway. At 10:15, Tyler's silver Honda pulled up, and Susan felt a rush of relief and affection. He was early, or at least reasonably on time, and he came directly to the door with a bright smile and a hug that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. He complimented the coffee cake immediately and asked where she wanted him to start. Within minutes, he was sorting through a box of photographs from the 1960s, asking questions about the people and places captured in the faded images. At 10:30, Rachel arrived, apologizing for being late, though she was actually right on time. She brought a bag of bagels and cream cheese, explaining that she thought people might get hungry. The gesture was small but significant, showing consideration beyond just showing up. Rachel immediately gravitated toward a box of old letters, fascinated by the handwriting and the formal language of correspondence from decades past. By 11 o'clock, no one else had arrived. Susan tried to hide her disappointment, keeping busy with small tasks and chatting with Tyler and Rachel. At 11:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer apologizing profusely, but explaining that she'd gotten called into work for an emergency. It was always emergencies with Jennifer, Susan noted mentally, though she responded with understanding. Marcus sent a text around noon saying he was running behind, but would definitely try to make it later. He never showed up. Emma sent a formal email explaining that she had misunderstood the date and had scheduled a study group but would absolutely be there next week. The younger ones were radio silent except for Sophia, who posted on social media about a brunch she was attending with friends, apparently having forgotten entirely about the Legacy project. The contrast between Tyler and Rachel, who spent the entire afternoon engaged and interested, versus the others was stark. Susan filled several pages in her journal that evening, noting not just who attended, but the quality of their presence. Tyler had stayed until almost 5 o'clock, seeming genuinely reluctant to leave. He'd shared stories about his own childhood memories, asked Susan about her experiences during different historical events, and even volunteered to come back during the week to help move some heavier boxes down from the attic. Rachel had been equally engaged, though in a different way. She'd gotten emotional looking at photographs of her late grandfather, Susan's husband, and had asked permission to take some pictures with her phone to show her own mother. The authenticity of her interest was unmistakable. Over the next several weeks, a pattern emerged that would define the entire experiment. Tyler and Rachel became regulars, showing up nearly every weekend and occasionally during weeknights when Susan mentioned specific tasks that needed attention. They were the core team, the reliable ones, the grandchildren who proved that their affection wasn't contingent on convenience or reward. Jennifer managed to appear 3 times over the course of 6 weeks, each visit marked by her arrival with elaborate Starbucks orders for everyone and enthusiastic declarations about how totally into the project she was. But her actual contributions were minimal. She'd sort through a few photos while simultaneously scrolling through her phone, offer superficial comments, and then leave after an hour or two claiming other obligations. Susan noticed that Jennifer always made sure to take pictures of herself helping with the project, which promptly appeared on her Instagram with captions about family values and honoring our roots. The performance of participation without the substance was duly noted in Susan's journal. Marcus finally appeared on the 4th weekend, arriving nearly an hour late with no apology. He spent most of his visit talking about his startup, occasionally picking up a photograph and making a cursory comment before launching back into his business ventures. When Susan tried to steer the conversation toward family history or stories from the past, Marcus would nod distractedly and then circle back to his own concerns. He left after 90 minutes, telling Susan it had been really great, but he was totally slammed with work for the foreseeable future. She never saw him again for the project. Emma approached the legacy work like a job, which was both admirable and slightly cold. She showed up exactly when she said she would, worked efficiently for exactly the time she'd allocated, and produced high-quality results. She created a detailed digital filing system for the photographs, set up a cloud storage solution, and even drafted a preliminary outline for what the final legacy document might look like. But there was something missing. Emma never asked personal questions. She never seemed curious about the actual stories behind the materials. She was completing a project, not connecting with her grandmother. Susan appreciated the help, but couldn't shake the feeling that Emma would have approached digitizing a stranger's photo collection with the same detached efficiency. The younger grandchildren were, as expected, mostly absent. Sophia appeared twice, both times treating the project like a photo opportunity. She posed with vintage items, took selfies with old photographs, and spent more time curating her social media presence than actually contributing. Brandon showed up once, stayed for 45 minutes while checking his phone constantly, and then left claiming he had to meet friends. Michael never appeared at all, but there was a surprise. Rachel brought along her boyfriend David to one session, and while he technically wasn't a grandchild, his behavior provided an interesting contrast. David spent an entire afternoon helping to organize materials, asked thoughtful questions, and even offered to help Susan with some household repairs he noticed needed attention. He had no stake in any inheritance, no familial obligation, yet he showed more genuine care and interest than most of Susan's actual grandchildren. It made Susan wonder about the nature of family bonds. Were blood relations and shared history enough to guarantee loyalty and affection? Or did genuine connection transcend these biological ties? As November turned into December, Susan escalated the test subtly. She began introducing tasks that required more significant sacrifices. She mentioned that she needed to go through materials stored at a family storage unit across town and would need help transporting boxes. It required a full-day commitment and physical labor. Tyler immediately volunteered and recruited Rachel. They spent an entire Saturday loading and unloading boxes, sorting through decades of accumulated family possessions, taking breaks only for the lunch Susan provided. They laughed together, shared stories, and treated the tedious work as an opportunity for connection rather than a burden. When Susan mentioned the same task to Jennifer over the phone, her granddaughter expressed enthusiastic support, but never actually committed to a specific date. Marcus, when told about it, suggested hiring professional movers and seemed confused about why Susan would ask family members to do such work. Emma offered to research moving services and create a cost-benefit analysis. None of them understood, or perhaps didn't want to understand, that the point wasn't just to move boxes. The point was to see who would show up for the unglamorous, difficult work that family sometimes requires. Susan also introduced what she privately called the emergency test. She mentioned casually to different grandchildren that she'd been feeling under the weather and might need someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment. It wasn't a complete fabrication. She did have a routine checkup scheduled, and while she was perfectly capable of driving herself, she wanted to see who would offer to accompany her. Tyler immediately cleared his schedule and insisted on picking her up, waiting through the appointment, and taking her to lunch afterward. Rachel, when told, offered to reschedule her own work commitments if Susan needed her. Jennifer sent a text saying she hoped Susan felt better and included several emoji hearts and a gif of a puppy. Marcus, characteristically, didn't respond at all to the message. Emma sent a list of well-rated doctors in the area, along with their contact information, missing entirely the implied request for accompaniment. The documentation in Susan's journal grew extensive. She recorded not just actions but motivations, not just presence but quality of engagement. She noted who remembered details from previous conversations, who asked follow-up questions about her health or well-being, who seemed to view time with her as a pleasure versus an obligation. The camera system she'd installed provided additional insights. When her grandchildren thought they weren't being directly observed, their true feelings emerged. She watched footage of Tyler carefully handling fragile family heirlooms with reverence, pausing to examine photographs and smile at memories. She saw Rachel wipe away tears when she came across a letter from Susan's late husband to his young bride. She also watched Jennifer check her phone compulsively, pose for selfies when she thought she was alone, and handle precious family photographs with careless haste. She saw Marcus spend 20 minutes on a business call while ostensibly sorting through materials, giving the work barely any attention. The evidence was mounting, creating an undeniable portrait of where genuine loyalty and affection existed and where it didn't. December brought the holiday season. Traditionally a time for family gathering and connection, Susan decided to use this opportunity for another layer of her test. She announced that instead of her usual elaborate Christmas dinner, she would be hosting a series of smaller, memory-sharing sessions where different family members could record their favorite stories about family history. She needed help organizing these sessions, preparing questions, and encouraging participation. It required significant coordination and effort. Tyler and Rachel immediately volunteered to co-host, spending hours helping Susan prepare questions, set up recording equipment, and reach out to extended family members. They turned it into a beautiful project, creating a welcoming atmosphere for storytelling and connection. Jennifer volunteered to promote the events on social media, which she did with professionally styled posts and hashtags, but offered no practical help with the actual organization. Marcus declined to participate at all, citing the demands of his startup. Emma offered to create a legal release form for recorded stories, which was actually useful, but again approached the entire endeavor from a purely functional rather than emotional perspective. The memory-sharing sessions themselves revealed additional truths. As extended family members gathered to share stories, Susan observed who facilitated conversations, who showed genuine interest in older relatives' tales, and who seemed bored or impatient. Tyler proved to be a natural interviewer, drawing out stories from shy relatives and making everyone feel heard and valued. Rachel was equally engaged, laughing and crying in appropriate moments, creating emotional connections across generational divides. When Jennifer attended one session, she spent most of it checking her phone and left early. Marcus appeared for 15 minutes at one gathering, stayed long enough to be seen, and then departed. Emma attended with a checklist of questions she'd prepared, conducting interviews with professional efficiency but personal coldness. The younger grandchildren were mostly absent, though Sophia appeared once, posted extensively about the adorable vintage vibes, and left without contributing meaningfully to any conversations. As Christmas approached, Susan made another calculated move. She let it slip, separately to each of her children, that she was reconsidering her estate plans. She didn't say anything explicit, didn't threaten or promise, just mentioned that she'd been thinking about what Richard would have wanted and how to ensure her legacy went to those who truly valued family and connection. She knew this information would trickle down to her grandchildren, as indeed it did. The effect was immediate and revealing. Within days, Jennifer called asking if she could come by to help with anything you need. Grandma. Marcus suddenly had time for a lunch meeting, during which he made several awkward attempts to demonstrate his devotion and connection. Emma sent a detailed email outlining her contributions to the legacy project and asking if there was anything else Susan needed. Even some of the younger grandchildren suddenly remembered the project's existence. But Tyler and Rachel's behavior didn't change at all. They continued showing up as they had been, with the same genuine interest and care. If anything, they seemed oblivious to the potential financial implications of their involvement. When Susan gently probed, asking if they'd heard she was reconsidering her estate plans, both expressed mild concern for her well-being, but no particular interest in the financial aspects. Rachel actually told her, "Grandma, I don't care about any of that. I just love spending time with you and learning these stories." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. This was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire experiment. The grandchildren who'd been genuinely devoted all along didn't change their behavior when inheritance was explicitly raised as a consideration. The ones who'd been distant or superficial suddenly became more attentive, but in ways that felt performative and transparently motivated by self-interest. Susan spent Christmas Day hosting a traditional family dinner, playing the role of gracious matriarch while privately observing every interaction with analytical precision. She noted who helped with preparation and cleanup versus who simply consumed and departed. She watched who engaged with elderly relatives versus who clustered with peers. She observed who thanked her with genuine warmth versus obligatory politeness. Tyler spent much of the day in the kitchen with Susan, chopping vegetables and sharing stories while she cooked. Rachel organized games that brought different generations together, creating moments of laughter and connection. Jennifer arrived with an expensive bottle of wine and spent most of the dinner talking about her upcoming vacation, barely asking Susan any questions about herself. Marcus checked his phone throughout the meal and left immediately after dessert. Emma helped with cleanup, but in a way that felt dutiful rather than affectionate, and the younger grandchildren were mostly absorbed in their devices, present physically but absent in every meaningful way. By early January, Susan had months of comprehensive data. Her journal was filled with detailed observations. Her computer contained hours of recorded footage. She had created, without anyone's knowledge except her own, one of the most thorough examinations of familial loyalty ever conducted. The question now was what to do with this information. Some people might have quietly adjusted their wills and said nothing, letting the distribution of assets speak for itself after death. But Susan was 72, in excellent health, and had no intention of waiting until she was gone to address what she'd discovered. She also felt that there were valuable lessons here, not just for her family, but potentially for others facing similar questions about the nature of modern family bonds. After considerable thought, Susan decided to host what she termed a family summit. She sent formal invitations to all her children and grandchildren, requesting their presence on a Saturday afternoon in late January for an important family announcement. The tone of the invitation made clear this wasn't optional. She provided lunch, which would soften the blow of what was to come. The Saturday arrived cold and gray, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds overhead. Susan's dining room had been transformed from the Legacy Project workspace into a proper meeting venue, with chairs arranged theater-style facing a small podium she'd borrowed from the local library. She'd prepared a multimedia presentation, something none of her family would expect from their grandmother, displaying her adaptability and technical competence. By 2 o'clock, everyone had arrived, the room filled with curious and slightly anxious family members. Susan's 3 children sat in the front row, exchanging confused glances. The grandchildren were scattered throughout the room, their postures reflecting their varying levels of concern and interest. Tyler and Rachel sat together near the front, both looking supportive but puzzled. Jennifer kept checking her phone. Marcus sat with crossed arms and an expression of impatience. Emma had brought a notebook, apparently ready to document whatever was announced. The younger ones clustered in the back, whispering among themselves. Susan took her position at the podium, looking out at her assembled family with a mixture of affection and steely resolve. She'd rehearsed this moment, knowing it would be uncomfortable but necessary. She began by thanking everyone for coming, and acknowledging that she'd been somewhat mysterious about the purpose of this gathering. Then she launched into what would become one of the most memorable family meetings in Hartwell history. She started by explaining the Legacy Project, which most of them knew about already, though many had barely participated. She thanked those who'd contributed, making special mention of Tyler and Rachel without yet explaining why they were being singled out. Then she paused, taking a breath before revealing the true nature of what had been happening over the past several months. She told them it had been a test, not a cruel trick, she emphasized, but a careful observation designed to understand the true nature of their relationships and loyalty. She explained her initial loneliness, her growing suspicion that she'd become an obligation rather than a beloved presence in their lives. She described her decision to create a situation that would reveal genuine devotion versus superficial family connection. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of shocked stillness that follows an unexpected revelation. Susan could see various reactions forming on different faces. Some grandchildren looked ashamed, others defensive, still others confused. Her children seemed mortified, perhaps seeing their own parenting being implicitly evaluated. Susan pressed on, explaining that she wasn't doing this to be manipulative or hurtful, but because she believed in the importance of truth in relationships. She had felt something was wrong and wanted to understand what was real. Then she began sharing her findings, and this was where the presentation became truly uncomfortable. She'd prepared a slideshow, tasteful but thorough, documenting the participation levels of each grandchild. There were charts showing attendance at project sessions, graphs illustrating time commitment, and even clips from her recorded footage showing different grandchildren's behavior when they thought they weren't being observed. The presentation was damning in its objectivity. There was no editorializing needed. The data spoke for itself. Tyler and Rachel's consistent presence and genuine engagement was obvious. Jennifer's superficial participation was laid bare, including screenshots of her social media posts about the project, contrasted with records of her actual minimal contribution. Marcus's near-total absence was meticulously documented. Emma's efficient yet cold participation was evident in her emails and recorded interactions. The younger grandchildren's general disinterest was evident in their attendance records. But Susan didn't just present negative findings. She also shared beautiful moments she'd captured. Tyler patiently explaining to her how to use photo editing software, his tone gentle and encouraging. Rachel crying over photographs of family members she'd never met, but felt connected to through stories. These moments illustrated what genuine intergenerational connection looked like, providing a positive example alongside the negative revelations. When she'd finished the presentation, Susan stepped out from behind the podium and addressed her family directly, her voice thick with emotion but steady in its conviction. She explained that this wasn't about punishment or reward, though it would certainly influence her estate planning. It was about understanding a fundamental truth that modern families often avoided discussing. Loyalty, she said, wasn't just about showing up when convenient or sending birthday cards or following social obligations. Real loyalty meant making someone a priority, sacrificing convenience for connection, and demonstrating through consistent actions that the relationship mattered. She'd discovered that only 2 of her 7 grandchildren possessed this quality, and she wanted everyone to understand why that was both heartbreaking and illuminating. The immediate aftermath was explosive. Jennifer burst into tears, defending herself through choked sobs about how busy her life was and how she'd always loved her grandmother. Marcus looked angry, arguing that the entire test was unfair and manipulative, that his absence reflected legitimate life pressures, not lack of affection. Emma, true to form, questioned the methodology of the test and whether the conclusions were scientifically valid. The younger grandchildren mostly looked uncomfortable, slouching in their chairs and avoiding eye contact. But Tyler and Rachel looked devastated, not for themselves, but for their grandmother and the pain that had prompted this entire experiment. Rachel approached Susan immediately, wrapping her in a hug and apologizing for not realizing how lonely she'd been, promising that her involvement had never been about any reward, but simply about loving her grandmother. Tyler echoed this sentiment, looking genuinely distressed that Susan had felt the need to test them at all. Susan's children were caught between defending their offspring and acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how they'd raised them and what values had been transmitted. Her son Robert, Marcus's father, was particularly defensive, arguing that young people today faced pressures previous generations didn't understand. Her daughter Patricia, Jennifer's mother, was more reflective, admitting she'd perhaps enabled Jennifer's self-centered behavior. Her youngest son David, father to Emma and Rachel, seemed proud of Rachel while also defensive about Emma's more pragmatic approach. The meeting devolved into a chaotic family therapy session, with various members defending themselves, others making accusations, and everyone grappling with the implications of what had been revealed. Susan let it unfold for a while, understanding that this catharsis was necessary, but eventually called for order. She explained that she had two purposes in revealing all of this today. The first was transparency. She refused to die having everyone wonder why certain decisions had been made regarding her estate. If Tyler and Rachel received preferential treatment, everyone would now understand exactly why. But the second purpose was more hopeful. She wanted to give everyone the opportunity to change, to understand what genuine family loyalty looked like, and to choose whether they wanted to cultivate it. This wasn't a permanent judgment of character, she emphasized. People could learn, grow, and modify their priorities. The test had revealed current realities, not fixed destinies. She announced that she would be giving everyone 6 months. During this time, she would no longer track or document their behavior. She wouldn't test them, but she would remain aware, as any perceptive person would be, of who made efforts to genuinely connect with her and who continued treating her as an obligation. At the end of 6 months, she would finalize her estate plans, and those plans would reflect what she'd observed over the entire period, test included. Then Susan did something unexpected. She invited anyone who wanted to stay for dinner to join her in the kitchen, where she'd prepared a simple meal of soup and bread. She announced that she'd love to share stories, play cards, or simply spend time together, with no agenda, no project, no strings attached. It was an olive branch, an opportunity for immediate redemption through simple presence. The response to this invitation was itself revealing. Tyler and Rachel immediately moved toward the kitchen, asking what they could do to help. After some hesitation, Emma joined as well, perhaps recognizing that her efficient but cold approach had been called out and wanting to demonstrate she could be different. Jennifer remained in her seat, texting furiously, before eventually leaving without saying goodbye, which only confirmed everything Susan had documented. Marcus left immediately after the meeting, offering a perfunctory hug but clearly angry about the entire situation. Several of the younger grandchildren also departed, while Sophia surprisingly stayed, perhaps recognizing she needed to make some kind of effort. That evening in Susan's kitchen was transformative in its own way. Without the structure of a project or the pressure of a test, genuine conversation emerged. Emma opened up about the pressures of law school and her fear of disappointing people, revealing insecurities Susan hadn't known existed. Sophia talked about feeling overlooked in a large family, always performing for attention, but never feeling truly seen. Tyler and Rachel shared their own challenges and dreams, creating a space of mutual vulnerability and connection. Susan reciprocated, sharing stories not of family history, but of her own fears, loneliness, and hopes. It was the kind of authentic intergenerational exchange that should happen regularly in families, but often doesn't. Prevented by busy schedules, emotional guardedness, and the superficial nature of much modern communication. As the evening wore on and the group eventually dispersed, Susan felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine hope. The test had been painful to conduct and revealing to share, but perhaps it had also been necessary. Sometimes families need their dysfunctions exposed before they can heal them. The following weeks and months unfolded with various family members responding to the revelation in different ways. Jennifer attempted a reconciliation through grand gestures, sending flowers and expensive gifts, apparently still not understanding that Susan valued time and presence over material expressions. Marcus remained distant, perhaps too proud to acknowledge his shortcomings or too busy to address them. But there were positive developments. Emma began calling weekly, not to report on tasks or request guidance, but simply to talk. The conversations were initially awkward, as Emma learned how to engage emotionally rather than transactionally. But over time, they became warmer and more natural. She started sharing personal struggles and asking Susan's advice, treating her grandmother as a mentor and confidant rather than a project manager. Sophia made a genuine effort to visit regularly, bringing along her sketchbook and sharing her artistic ambitions. Without the pressure of a structured project, she relaxed and revealed herself to be thoughtful and creative in ways that hadn't been apparent before. Susan discovered she actually enjoyed spending time with Sophia when the teenager wasn't performing for social media. Even some of the younger grandchildren began appearing more regularly, perhaps prompted by parental pressure, but gradually discovering that time with their grandmother could actually be enjoyable. Brandon, the meme-sending grandson who'd barely participated in the project, surprised everyone by developing a genuine interest in Susan's stories about the 1960s and 70s, finding unexpected parallels between those cultural upheavals and his own generation's challenges. Tyler and Rachel continued as they'd always been, consistent and genuine, though their presence now felt even more precious to Susan, given the contrast with how others had behaved. She made a point of telling them how much their loyalty meant, not just during the test, but always. She also made sure they understood that her love wasn't conditional on their service, but was freely given regardless of what they did or didn't do for her. By the time Susan's self-imposed 6-month evaluation period concluded, the family dynamics had shifted significantly. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Jennifer remained largely superficial in her engagement, and Marcus stayed distant. But enough had changed that Susan felt optimistic about the future. More importantly, she'd stopped feeling invisible and taken for granted. The test had forced her family to see her as a person with feelings, needs, and perceptions, not just as a grandmother-shaped figure who existed to provide unconditional love without expecting anything in return. When Susan finalized her estate plans, she did so with clarity and confidence. The bulk of her estate would be divided between Tyler and Rachel, with specific meaningful items going to other grandchildren who'd made genuine efforts during the 6-month period. Emma received financial support for law school along with some family heirlooms, recognizing her growth and change. Sophia inherited art supplies and materials along with funds designated for creative education. Even the younger ones received appropriate inheritances, scaled to reflect their efforts and relationships. Jennifer and Marcus received minimal distributions, not out of vindictiveness, but as a natural consequence of the relationships they'd chosen to maintain. Susan included letters with each bequest, explaining her reasoning. For Tyler and Rachel, the letters overflowed with gratitude and love, acknowledging their consistent devotion and genuine care. For those who'd made efforts to change, the letters were encouraging, recognizing their growth. For those who'd remained distant, the letters were honest, but not cruel, explaining that inheritance should reflect actual relationships, not biological proximity or social expectations. The story of Susan's loyalty test eventually spread beyond the immediate family, shared by various members in different contexts. Some people who heard about it were scandalized, viewing the entire experiment as manipulative and wrong. Others found it brilliant, wishing they had the courage to conduct similar evaluations in their own families. The debate itself was valuable, forcing people to think critically about what family loyalty really meant and how it should be demonstrated. Susan became something of an unlikely influencer in her community, with other elderly people seeking her advice about managing relationships with adult children and grandchildren. She was careful not to present herself as an expert or to suggest that her approach was right for everyone. But she did share her core insight that genuine connection requires honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable, and that people generally rise or fall to the expectations set for them. If you expect nothing from family except obligatory appearances at holidays, that's likely what you'll receive. If you create opportunities for deeper engagement and make clear that such engagement matters, some people will step up to meet that standard. Looking back on the entire experience a year later, Susan felt no regrets. The test had been emotionally difficult to design and execute. The revelation had been painful for everyone involved. But the truth that emerged had been necessary and ultimately liberating. She'd stopped wondering whether her grandchildren loved her because she now knew exactly where she stood with each of them. More importantly, she'd created an opportunity for change and watched several of her grandchildren rise to meet it. The legacy project itself had actually been completed, with Tyler, Rachel, Emma, and surprisingly Sophia working together to create a comprehensive digital archive of the Hartwell family history. What had begun as a test had become something genuinely valuable, a resource that future generations could access to understand their roots and heritage. The archive included hundreds of digitized photographs, recorded interviews with family members, transcribed letters, and a narrative history that Susan had dictated over many sessions. It was housed on a custom website that Emma had designed with surprising creativity, featuring an intuitive interface that even the least tech-savvy family members could navigate. Rachel had written beautiful introductory essays for different sections, providing context and emotional resonance. Tyler had organized everything with meticulous care, creating cross-references and connections that made the archive feel alive rather than static. Even Sophia had contributed, creating artistic interpretations of family stories and designing visual elements that gave the site personality and warmth. The project had transformed from a loyalty test into a genuine family treasure, which felt appropriate somehow. What had started in loneliness and suspicion had concluded in connection and understanding. Susan sometimes wondered what Richard would have thought about the entire experiment. Her late husband had been more forgiving than she was, more inclined to assume the best about people's intentions. But he'd also been pragmatic and valued truth over comfortable illusions. She thought he would have approved, if perhaps with some gentle teasing about her dramatic flair. The test had also prompted Susan to examine her own behavior and assumptions. She'd realized that she'd been somewhat passive in her loneliness, waiting for her grandchildren to initiate contact rather than making her needs explicitly known. The modern expectation seemed to be that elderly people should be endlessly patient and understanding, never demanding attention or expressing disappointment. But why should that be the case? Why couldn't she expect reciprocity in her relationships, even with younger family members? The test had been her way of asserting that she had needs and standards, that relationships required effort from both sides. One unexpected outcome was the effect on her children, Tyler's, Rachel's, and the other grandchildren's parents. The revelation of how their children had behaved prompted some serious self-reflection about the values they'd transmitted. Robert, Marcus's father, had a particularly difficult reckoning, recognizing that he'd modeled a workaholic lifestyle that prioritized professional success over family connection. He'd essentially taught Marcus that relationships were less important than achievements, then been surprised when his son treated family as a low priority. Patricia, Jennifer's mother, recognized that she'd perhaps been too indulgent, never requiring her daughter to think beyond herself or consider others' needs. She'd wanted Jennifer to have high self-esteem, but had inadvertently created someone who couldn't see beyond her own desires and perceptions. David, father to Emma and Rachel, felt validated in some ways, but also challenged to consider why one daughter had developed genuine empathy while the other had become so transactional. He and his wife spent considerable time discussing what had been different in how they'd related to their two daughters, and what lessons might be extracted. The family dynamics continued evolving throughout that first year after the revelation. Holiday gatherings were different, marked by more genuine conversation and less superficial pleasantness. People asked harder questions of each other, expressed disappointments more directly, and also celebrated connections more explicitly. It was messier than the polite distance that had characterized previous gatherings, but it was also more real. Susan noticed that the family had essentially split into two groups. There were those who'd taken the test results as a wake-up call and had genuinely worked to improve their relationships. And there were those who remained defensive or distant, unwilling to acknowledge that their behavior had been lacking. The division wasn't permanent or absolute. People moved between the groups as they grew and changed, but it was noticeable. Jennifer represented the most stubborn case. Even a year later, she seemed unable to grasp what had been missing in her relationship with Susan. She continued, operating on the assumption that love was a feeling you claimed to have rather than a commitment you demonstrated through consistent action. Her visits remained infrequent and superficial, marked by elaborate social media documentation but little genuine engagement. Susan had largely made peace with this, recognizing that some people are limited in their capacity for depth and that accepting this limitation was healthier than continuing to hope for change that wouldn't come. Marcus had taken a different path, essentially removing himself from the family sphere almost entirely. He showed up for major events like weddings or funerals, but maintained no ongoing relationship with Susan or most other family members. Susan suspected this was partly pride, an inability to admit he'd been wrong, and partly genuine prioritization of his professional life over personal connections. She felt sad about this outcome, but also recognized it was his choice to make. She'd extended opportunities for reconciliation, and he'd declined them. That was information about who he was and what he valued. The younger grandchildren's trajectories were more hopeful, perhaps because they were still forming their identities and habits. Brandon, after his initial interest in Susan's historical stories, had developed into a regular visitor who seemed to genuinely enjoy their conversations. He'd brought friends to meet her on several occasions, apparently finding her interesting enough to show off. Michael, the youngest, remained somewhat distant, but had at least started acknowledging her existence beyond obligatory holiday appearances. He'd begun texting her occasionally, usually with questions about family history for school projects, but the contact represented progress. What particularly pleased Susan was watching Rachel and Tyler's relationship with her deepen into something approaching friendship. They'd moved beyond grandparent-grandchild dynamics into more peer-like connection, where they could discuss ideas, debate perspectives, and share vulnerabilities. Rachel had started bringing her serious boyfriend around regularly, including him in the family fold in ways that suggested she was building her own sense of what family meant. Tyler had gone through a difficult breakup and had turned to Susan for advice and comfort, trusting her with emotional struggles he apparently couldn't share with his parents. These relationships felt like validation of everything Susan had been trying to understand and cultivate. Emma's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic. The young woman who'd approached the legacy project like a business transaction had slowly learned to access and express her emotions more freely. She still had organizational tendencies and loved structure. Those were core aspects of her personality, but she'd learned to balance efficiency with warmth. Her weekly calls with Susan had become highlights for both of them, ranging across topics from law school stress to relationship questions to philosophical discussions about justice and morality. Susan had watched Emma's gradual opening with fascination and delight, recognizing that sometimes people's apparent coldness is actually fear of vulnerability rather than lack of feeling. By the 18-month mark after the initial revelation, Susan felt confident that the loyalty test, controversial as it had been, had ultimately strengthened her family rather than damaging it. Not all the outcomes were positive, and not everyone had responded well, but truth had been established as a family value. People knew where they stood with each other. Expectations were clearer. The relationships that remained were stronger for having been tested and proven genuine. Susan also noticed changes in how other family members related to each other, not just to her. Tyler and Rachel had become closer, bonded by their shared experience of being the good grandchildren and by genuine affinity. Emma and Rachel had worked through some sibling rivalry issues that had apparently festered for years, reaching new understanding through honest conversations, facilitated partly by the family reckoning. Even some of the cousins who'd barely known each other previously had developed connections through the Legacy Project and subsequent family gatherings. The Hartwell family wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was more authentic than it had been. People were less likely to coast on assumptions or maintain relationships purely through obligatory gestures. The test had raised the bar for what counted as family connection, and while not everyone was willing or able to meet that bar, those who did found the relationships more satisfying and meaningful. Susan's friends and neighbors had varied reactions when they heard about what she'd done. Some were openly admiring, wishing they had her courage and clarity. Others were critical, suggesting she'd been manipulative or that family relationships shouldn't be tested in such calculated ways. A few shared their own stories of disappointment with adult children or grandchildren, finding in Susan a sympathetic listener who understood the particular loneliness of elderly people who'd been reduced to afterthoughts in their families' busy lives. One conversation particularly stuck with Susan. Her friend Margaret, a widow of similar age, had initially been critical of the test, calling it playing games with people's emotions. But several months later, Margaret had admitted that she'd been thinking about Susan's experiment constantly. She'd started observing her own grandchildren's behavior more analytically and had realized that she too was being taken for granted, that her relationships were sustained more by her efforts than theirs. Margaret hadn't conducted a formal test, but she had started being more honest about her needs and expectations, and the results had been mixed but ultimately illuminating, much like Susan's experience. This suggested to Susan that the issues she'd been grappling with weren't unique or unusual. Many elderly people found themselves in similar positions, loving family members who rarely reciprocated that love with consistent presence and attention. The difference was that most people suffered this quietly, afraid to demand more or to acknowledge the painful truth of their situations. Susan's willingness to face the truth head-on, while uncomfortable, had at least provided clarity and opportunity for change. The test had also prompted Susan to think more broadly about what modern families owed each other. Traditional societies had clear expectations around caring for elderly relatives, even if those expectations were sometimes burdensome. Modern Western culture had embraced individualism and autonomy, which brought tremendous benefits but also sometimes left elderly people isolated. Adult children were expected to build their own lives, pursue their own dreams, establish their own families. This was healthy and appropriate, but somewhere in that process, the connection to previous generations often frayed to near invisibility. Susan didn't want to return to some idealized past where multiple generations lived under one roof out of economic necessity rather than choice. But she did think there needed to be better balance, clearer expectations around maintaining relationships across generational divides. If family meant anything beyond genetic connection, it required ongoing effort and prioritization. Her test had been one grandmother's attempt to understand whether such effort existed in her particular family and to create consequences when it didn't. As Susan approached her 74th birthday, she found herself in a surprisingly good place emotionally and relationally. She had close connections with several grandchildren, cordial relationships with others, and honest distance from those who'd proven unable or unwilling to invest in relationship. She'd stopped feeling lonely because she'd stopped depending on people who couldn't or wouldn't show up for her. She'd invested more deeply in the relationships that actually worked, and those relationships had flourished under attention and care. She'd also developed new friendships with people her own age who shared her interests and values, recognizing that she'd perhaps been too dependent on family for all her social and emotional needs. She joined a book club, started volunteering at the local historical society, and developed a rich life that didn't revolve entirely around waiting for grandchildren to visit. When they did visit, it was a joy. When they didn't, she had other sources of meaning and connection. The legacy archive continued to grow as other family members added their own materials and stories. It had taken on a life beyond Susan's original vision, becoming a true family resource that even distant relatives accessed and contributed to. Tyler had become the informal curator, maintaining and updating the site with new content. Rachel had started conducting interviews with elderly relatives before their stories were lost, recognizing the value of preserving these perspectives. Even some family members who'd been on the periphery of the original drama had gotten involved, appreciating the archive as a family treasure. Susan sometimes reflected on whether she could have achieved the same outcomes without the test, through simply being more direct about her needs and feelings. Perhaps. But she suspected that without the dramatic revelation and concrete evidence, her concerns would have been dismissed or minimized. People could easily rationalize their behavior when it wasn't documented, could convince themselves they were doing enough when they weren't. The test had provided objective data that couldn't be argued with. It had forced everyone to confront reality rather than comfortable fictions. The question of the inheritance remained somewhat controversial within the family. Those who'd been largely excluded from Susan's will, particularly Jennifer and Marcus, sometimes made comments suggesting they felt the situation was unfair. But Susan had provided them with clear explanations in her letters, and she'd given them opportunities to change the situation through changing their behavior. The door was never completely closed. If their relationships with her genuinely transformed, she could always modify her estate plans. But she wasn't going to reward absence and superficiality simply because of biological connection. Tyler and Rachel, for their part, seemed almost uncomfortable with their preferential treatment. They'd insisted multiple times that their relationship with Susan wasn't about money or inheritance. Susan believed them and appreciated their discomfort, as it confirmed that their motives had indeed been pure. But she also felt they deserved to benefit from their loyalty and care. Why shouldn't people who'd consistently shown up and invested in relationship receive more than those who hadn't? The idea that all family members should receive equal treatment regardless of the quality of their relationships seemed absurd to Susan. Yet it was a common expectation. Emma's inheritance, substantial but not equal to Tyler and Rachel's, reflected her intermediate position. She'd started poorly, approaching everything transactionally, but she'd learned and grown. Susan wanted to acknowledge both the initial shortcoming and the subsequent growth. The inheritance was teaching Emma that change and effort were noticed and valued. Sophia's inheritance was smaller, reflecting her youth and shorter track record, but included specific items and funds that showed Susan had paid attention to her interests and dreams. It was an investment in potential, rather than a reward for established behavior. One unexpected development in the second year after the test was that several family members asked Susan to share her methodology and findings more broadly. Rachel, who'd gone into social work, thought there were valuable lessons for other families struggling with similar dynamics. Tyler, who worked in tech, suggested creating some kind of resource or toolkit that could help other elderly people assess their family relationships. Even Emma, ever the pragmatist, thought there might be legal and estate planning implications that could benefit others. Susan was initially reluctant. The test had been deeply personal, and she wasn't sure she wanted to become any kind of public figure around family loyalty issues. But as she thought about it more, she recognized that her experience might indeed be valuable to others. If nothing else, it might give permission to other elderly people to expect more from their families and to be honest about disappointment when those expectations weren't met. She eventually agreed to be interviewed for a local newspaper article about intergenerational family dynamics. The article, which presented her story with sensitivity and nuance, generated an enormous response. Susan received dozens of letters and emails from people sharing their own struggles with feeling invisible or taken for granted by adult children and grandchildren. Many thanked her for having the courage to address an issue that was widely experienced but rarely discussed. Some shared their own versions of loyalty tests, informal observations, and assessments they'd conducted. Others asked for advice on how to improve their situations. The response confirmed Susan's suspicion that she'd touched on something universal. In an era of unprecedented longevity, many people were spending decades in old age, often with declining health and mobility, but sharp minds and emotional needs. Meanwhile, their adult children and grandchildren were busier than ever, stretched thin by work demands, financial pressures, and their own family obligations. The resulting disconnection was common, painful, and rarely addressed directly. Susan couldn't solve this societal issue, but she could model one approach: honesty, testing when necessary, and holding people accountable for the relationships they claimed to value. She began writing a short memoir about her experience, not because she considered herself a writer, but because she wanted to document the story in her own words. The process of writing forced her to examine her motivations, actions, and reactions more deeply. She recognized places where she could have handled things differently, moments when she'd been harsher than necessary or had perhaps enjoyed the power of the test a little too much. She also recognized the validity of her core insight, that love without demonstration is meaningless, that family ties require tending, and that elderly people deserve better than polite neglect. The memoir took her nearly a year to complete, with significant help from Rachel and Emma, who served as editors and reality checkers. Tyler designed a simple website where the memoir could be shared freely, along with the newspaper article and some resources for other families. Susan insisted it not be commercial. She didn't want to profit from her family's pain and growth, but she did want the story available for those who might benefit from it. The response was again overwhelming. Susan found herself in email correspondence with people around the world who'd read her story and recognized their own situations in it. Some reported conducting their own versions of the test, with varying results. Others said they'd simply started being more direct with family members about their needs and expectations, finding that honesty sometimes prompted change. Still others shared that they'd given up on certain relationships after recognizing they were one-sided, and that this acceptance had brought peace rather than pain. Through these correspondences, Susan refined her thinking about family loyalty and what it meant across different cultures and contexts. She recognized that her experience was filtered through her particular background. White, middle-class American, with resources and education that provided options not everyone had. Family dynamics looked different in other cultures, where expectations around elder care were more explicit and demanding. She tried to be thoughtful about not presenting her experience as universal, while still believing there were core truths about human relationships that transcended particular contexts. By her 75th birthday, Susan had become something she'd never anticipated, a minor thought leader on intergenerational family relationships. She'd been invited to speak at several conferences on aging and family dynamics. She'd been interviewed for podcasts and online publications. Researchers studying family bonds had reached out, interested in her methodology and findings. It was surreal and sometimes overwhelming, but also deeply satisfying. She'd turned her personal pain into something useful for others. The Hartwell family continued its evolution, with the test and its aftermath becoming part of the family lore, a defining event that people referenced when discussing their relationships. New additions to the family, like Rachel's husband and eventually Tyler's fiancé, were told the story as a kind of initiation, a way of understanding the family's values and expectations. Some found it charming, others found it intense, but everyone understood that the Hartwell family took relationships seriously and expected reciprocity. Susan's 75th birthday party was itself a testament to how things had changed. Unlike her 70th birthday, which had been a dutiful affair where people showed up, stayed the appropriate amount of time, and left, this celebration felt genuinely joyful. Tyler and Rachel organized it together, transforming Susan's backyard into a beautiful event space. But more important than the decorations was the quality of presence. People stayed for hours, conversations were deep and genuine, laughter was frequent and real. Even some family members who'd been on the periphery of Susan's life made obvious efforts to connect meaningfully. Jennifer attended, though she remained somewhat stiff and performative. Marcus had been invited, but didn't come, sending an expensive gift with a card. Susan felt no disappointment about his absence. She'd learned to accept people for who they were, rather than who she wished they would be. His consistent distance was information about his priorities, and she could make her peace with that information without bitterness. Emma gave a toast at the party that brought Susan to tears. She spoke about how difficult and valuable her grandmother's honesty had been, how being called out for her transactional approach to relationships had ultimately helped her become a better person. She thanked Susan for caring enough to test them, for not accepting superficial connection as sufficient, and for teaching her that love required demonstration, not just declaration. It was a remarkable moment of vulnerability and growth from someone who'd started the entire process so closed off emotionally. Rachel's toast was different, but equally moving. She spoke about how Susan had always made her feel seen and valued, how their relationship had taught her what genuine connection across generations could look like. She promised to maintain and build on what they'd created together, to pass down not just the family stories in the archive, but the values of presence, honesty, and reciprocity that Susan had insisted upon. Tyler didn't give a formal toast, but pulled Susan aside during the party for a private conversation. He told her that everything he understood about loyalty, commitment, and showing up for people he learned from watching her navigate the aftermath of the test. She'd been disappointed but not bitter, honest but not cruel, firm but not rigid. He hoped to emulate those qualities in his own relationships. Susan was moved by all of these expressions but also slightly embarrassed. She'd never intended to become any kind of role model. She'd simply been a lonely grandmother who devised a plan to understand why she felt invisible to people she loved. The fact that this personal experiment had resonated with so many people and had transformed her family's dynamics was gratifying, but also somewhat surprising. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Susan sat on her porch watching the sunset, reflecting on the journey from that lonely autumn day when she'd first conceived the test. She'd been driven by sadness and suspicion, hurt by what felt like indifference from people who should have cared. The test had confirmed some of her worst suspicions, but had also revealed unexpected depths and had created opportunities for growth and change. If she were to distill everything she'd learned into core principles, they would be these. First, honesty in relationships is essential, even when it's uncomfortable. Pretending everything is fine when it isn't serves no one and allows dysfunction to continue unchecked. Second, love requires demonstration through consistent action, not just periodic gestures or declarations. Feelings without behavior are meaningless. Third, it's appropriate and healthy to have expectations for relationships and to create consequences when those expectations aren't met. Being endlessly accommodating doesn't actually help anyone grow. Fourth, people reveal their true priorities through how they allocate their time and attention. Busy schedules are real constraints, but they're also choices about what matters most. Fifth, change is possible, but only when people genuinely want to change and are willing to do the uncomfortable work of examining their behavior and motivations. You can't force transformation, but you can create conditions that make it possible. Sixth, some relationships will never be what you hope they'll be, and accepting this limitation is healthier than continuing to be disappointed. Not everyone has the capacity for depth, and that's information you can use to adjust your expectations and invest your energy elsewhere. Seventh, intergenerational connections require effort from both sides. The burden shouldn't fall entirely on the elderly person to maintain relationships, nor should young people be expected to read minds about what their elders need. Explicit communication about needs and expectations is crucial. Finally, family is defined by genuine connection, not just biological proximity. The people who consistently show up, who demonstrate care through action, who make you feel seen and valued, those are your true family, regardless of whether you share DNA. Susan had learned all of this through her experiment, and while the process had been painful, she wouldn't change it. The clarity she now had about her relationships was infinitely preferable to the anxious uncertainty she'd lived with before. She knew who loved her genuinely and who didn't. She knew which relationships to invest in and which to accept as limited. She had depth with some family members and polite distance with others, and both categories felt appropriate and sustainable. As darkness settled over the neighborhood and Susan prepared to go inside, she felt profound gratitude. Not everything had turned out as she'd hoped. Some grandchildren remained distant or superficial, but others had stepped up in ways that exceeded her expectations. The relationships she'd cultivated with Tyler, Rachel, Emma, and increasingly with Sophia and Brandon felt rich and genuine. They brought her joy rather than anxiety, connection rather than loneliness. The legacy archive they'd created together would outlast her, providing future generations with access to family stories and wisdom. Her memoir and the conversations it had prompted might help other families navigate similar challenges. The test that had begun in loneliness and suspicion had ultimately created something beautiful and valuable, both for her family and potentially for others. Susan went inside, locked the door, and prepared for bed, feeling more content than she had in years. Tomorrow, Tyler was coming over to help her with some technology issues, and Rachel had invited her to lunch later in the week. Emma was calling on Sunday for their weekly conversation. Her calendar had actual plans with people who genuinely wanted to spend time with her, not out of obligation, but because they valued the relationship. The transformation wasn't complete. Families are perpetually works in progress, constantly evolving as people change and circumstances shift. But the foundation had been established: honesty, demonstrated care, reciprocity, and genuine connection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Susan felt confident that she'd created something sustainable and real, relationships that would endure not because they had to, but because everyone involved wanted them to. The shocking truth about her grandchildren's loyalty had indeed been exposed. And while some of what had been revealed was disappointing, enough was beautiful and genuine to make the entire experience worthwhile. Susan had learned that testing loyalty isn't about catching people failing. It's about creating clarity, establishing standards, and giving people opportunities to choose what kind of relationships they want to maintain. Some would rise to meet those standards, others wouldn't, and both outcomes provided valuable information. In the end, Susan had gotten what she'd set out to find: truth. Not the comfortable fiction of family members who claimed to love her while rarely demonstrating it, but the honest reality of who actually cared enough to show up consistently. That truth, however mixed, had set her free from anxiety and uncertainty. She knew where she stood with everyone, and that knowledge, combined with the genuine connections she'd deepened and the positive changes she'd witnessed, made the entire difficult process worthwhile. As she drifted off to sleep, Susan thought about the question she'd posed at the beginning of all this. Did her grandchildren actually love her, or had she become merely an obligation? The answer, she now understood, was both. Some genuinely loved her and demonstrated that love consistently. Others felt obligatory affection without genuine connection. The key was distinguishing between the two categories and adjusting her expectations and investments accordingly. The test had provided that distinction with painful clarity, and while the knowledge sometimes hurt, it also liberated her to focus her time and emotional energy on relationships that were actually reciprocal and meaningful. That, ultimately, was the gift of the loyalty test, not the specific outcomes, but the clarity that allowed her to live more honestly and invest more wisely in the relationships that truly mattered.